It was Richard Hakluyt, the Elizabethan promoter of colonization, who first employed the term waste people to describe the expendables that could be literally dumped in the New World. In his 1584 Discourse of Western Planting, he hoped to persuade the Queen of the merits of colonization. Hakluyt called America not terra firma, but a waste firm. The American landscape, though he'd never seen it, was described as an unproductive terrain that could only be improved by turning the waste firm into one giant workhouse filled with all the idle dregs drawn from English society. Ex-soldiers, orphans, children of wandering beggars, criminals, debtors, vagrants. And if they were lucky enough to survive, these idols might be recycled and sent off to fight in English wars. Now, the group that the British and the English hated the most were vagrants. They were idle folk, analogized to weeds stifling healthy growth in a garden. They wandered the countryside, detached from the economy, much like the wasteland left fallow and untilled. So they were rounded up, some were branded, put into workhouses. Children were actually taken off the streets and sold as indentured servants to cruel masters in America. They were also notably referred to as the offscourings. And I'm going to use that term again. It's a rather unpleasant term, which refers to fecal waste. And so does the quote that I have there. Now, this notion of waste in all its various manifestations persisted. Abigail Adams dismissed the poor and landless as rubbish. So did Thomas Jefferson, who proposed that a few promising, impoverished white boys might be, quote, raked from the rubbish and given an education. But his bill, drafted in 1779, failed in the Virginia legislature. The ruling elite had little desire to raise up even a few wastrels. As for the language of human stocks, it wasn't eat, pray, love, but it was eat, graze, and breed, whether on 2 or 4 legs. Political arithmetic, pre-Darwin, proposed a means to calculate human productivity. Benjamin Franklin was an early proponent who compared human patterns of migration and fertility to that of ants and pigeons. The unsettled frontier land was a lure to families, he argued, like ants to a honeypot. Overcrowding in pigeon boxes in the experiment that he did meant that the weak would have to move on. Franklin's demographic argument constituted an early form of survival of the fittest. Those who bred large families and toiled long were rewarded, while the idle would have to either keep moving or die off. And as you can guess, Franklin had no sympathy for the poor whatsoever, even though he did not come from an elite family. Breeding was at the heart of the domestic slave trade, and Jefferson coldly admitted that female slaves were a good investment. To his mind, free white women were breeders too. In a series of letters that he exchanged with John Adams in 1813, he argued that humans were animals guided by the overriding impulse of sexual desire. Lust, however, if it was tempered by reason among the most gifted, he argued, was producing what he called a fortuitous concourse of breeders. This model of breeding generated for Jefferson an accidental aristocracy of talent. Class division arose through natural selection. Superior men were supposed to marry for more than money. They would consciously and unconsciously choose mates with favorable traits. It was all a matter of probability. Now, the question neither Jefferson or his calculating colleagues never answered was this: what happened to those outside the talented, rational elite? What future awaited the concourse of breeders living on the bottom layer of society? No matter how one finessed it, rubbish produced more rubbish. Now, Jefferson, like Franklin, hoped the poor would be drawn into the Western territories. So this is why our Western territories were like the colonies for the British. They were to drain away the poor and the waste. What also became prevalent in Jefferson's theory and proved to be long-lasting in justifying why the United States was truly a promised land was the idea that horizontal mobility would substitute for upward mobility. That means moving across the land was the alternative to actually moving up the social ladder. And this theory is important because it laid the foundation for America's myth of a classless, exceptional society. But if we think about that logically, and if we think about that as historians, this theory was flawed from the get-go. The West was never an open space. Land speculators and powerful men always had the advantage in purchasing the best land. Western land wasn't free, and the poor rarely had the funds to buy the parcels sold by the federal government. Instead, they invaded public lands as trespassers, and the government often had to physically remove them. They became the dominant class of the early republic and the antebellum period that you've never heard of. America's version of English vagrants, squatters, and crackers. Now, the legendary Davy Crockett, believe it or not, was an outspoken advocate of squatters' rights. That's the real Crockett, not the legend. The legend, as you see here, taken from a popular sort of comic, exaggerated version of Crockett and the stories he told, portrayed him as a corn cracker, which is a variation, it's the Kentucky variation of cracker. Now, what's funny about Crockett is that he also claimed, the legendary version, and this, based on the stories that he told, claimed that one of the many excellent powers that he had the ability to squat down lower than any man. Now, that may sound strange. We can understand him claiming to be Superman and jump as high as he possibly could, and he claimed that he could do all these magical things, but this allusion is particularly important because he's referring to his own squatter past. And as we know, the idea of being a squatter is not simply something to celebrate. The words squat and squatting carried more than one disreputable meaning. The term suggested spilling out across the land, and it also had other more unpleasant allusions to waste. But it also had a significant legal meaning. In the British law, which we inherited, squatting was the opposite of standing, to have legal standing. And legal standing also was part of the legal principle, the English legal principle, that justified claims to sovereignty and also justifies the right to the land, to have standing. The word right itself comes from the root that means to stand erect. So it's important that we visualize what these words mean. The cracker, that's a term you've probably all heard of. What's interesting is cracker gets associated with the southern backcountry. And quite early, in the 1760s, a British officer in the Carolinas described crackers as idle stragglers, vagabonds worse than Indians, who were constantly changing their place of abode. The word cracker migrated all the way from Virginia to Florida, along with the roving, migrating rural poor. Now, why the name cracker? What does that really mean? Where does that come from? Well, they were called cracking traders before the Revolution because they were described as noisy braggarts, prone to lying and vulgarity. In English, one could crack a jest. Crude Englishmen cracked wind. Firecrackers gave off a stench and were loud and disrupted. Louse cracker referred to a lice-ridden, slovenly fellow. And another significant connection was the adjective crack-brained, which was the English slang for idle-headed. Again, reminding us that the poor are always idle. And this is a kind of recurrent obsession for the English and for American colonists. Squatters and crackers weren't yeomen, they weren't peasants, they weren't tenants. Cracker women were looked at as barely being women at all. They were mocked as haggard, lean, dirty, ugly, and toothless. Hoosieroons, a variation on mixed-race quadroons, was a word coined to describe Indiana squatters' dozen of dirty yellow urchins. And that word, Hoosier, no linguistic knows where it comes from. They have no idea. They can't figure it out.